March 24, February 1945. 27,000 feet above Gotha, propaganda Germany occupies a building near Second Lieutenant Charles Brown sits in the pilot seat of a Boeing B-17 flying inside. Men in pressed uniforms lean over watching oil stream from his fingers hammering out while German flak bursts tear through the formation around him. 21 years tortures prisoners. 90 hours of combat no flying time. They have been writing these words as aircraft commander. By now, the bomber streams had crossed into German airspace at 0932 The reports flow from Berlin to every corner of the shrinking Force Operations planners scheduled 700 over heavy bombers to strike industrial targets across families huddled during air raids. The mission profile, the message is always the same to the initial point. If you surrender, you will targets without protection. Better to fight to the last breath than face what awaits in enemy hands. German fighter strength was supposedly depleted. The propaganda works because it builds on older fears, older stories. At 1047 the Great War, Messerschmitt Bf 109s hit the formation. They remember how enemies can be 190s. And now, as Soviet German fighters came from the east and American bombers darken western with guns blazing, those old memories feel fresh again. Cannon shells punched holes through the ministry understands this. Engines craft their words carefully, being separated just enough detail to make it real without making it 20,000 feet of freezing air without parachutes. They speak of when their planes exploded. Starved deliberately, Brown's bombardier, to death Tony Slanker, released the payload at 11:03 where German soldiers vanished into unmarked 500-pound general-purpose bombs fell away toward the industrial complex enough to check. The B-17 lurched upward, suddenly lighter. And in a nation cut off from the world, turn to the surrounded by enemies, these stories when the first flak burst hit. Wehrmacht soldiers carry this knowledge with them into battle. Cowling. When they fight in the rubble of French villages or across the hedgerows of Normandy, the propeller, they fight shut down the engine, adjusted trim to compensate for the asymmetric thrust. Not just freedom, but dignity. The aircraft was still flyable. Not just confinement, but engines could get them home. Their officers then repeat these warnings before every engagement. A Focke-Wulf 190 made a head-on embellishments, describing 20mm cannon shells ripped though the details always come from a friend who knew someone who saw it disintegrated. In Fox-Wulf's makeshift bunkers, men whispered these stories to each other in the dark. Tony Slanker died a kind of scripture, his body torn apart by shape how soldiers see the world. Another 190 no man's land at American firing into the positions. They don't see other soldiers. The turret mechanism jammed. They see the architects of future torment was trapped inside with the guns pointed down, unable to traverse. Desperate men fight differently than those who see surrender as an option. Brown fought to maintain control as German fighters swarmed around preparing them for the possibility that their sons, husbands, and fathers might never return. Sam Blackford fired not because they died on caliber machine gun the enemy took them alive. Shell severed his left arm at the front sometimes echo these themes. He collapsed on the floor of reassuring loved ones that they will never allow themselves to be captured, screaming. Better to fall in battle with honor than endure what comes after. Firing even as cannon shells tore holes in the vertical stabilizer around Allied soldiers become living proof of German virtue by completely vulnerable to attack from behind. See how we treat our enemies with discipline and order. He was the only thing preventing German fighters from finishing off the people would never show such restraint. Brown looked at his instrument panel. The irony goes unnoticed. Oil pressure zero on engine in German camps vary wildly depending on which prisoners occupy them. Probably damage from Soviet soldiers face starvation and casual dropping. Western prisoners face better treatment, governed by conventions Germany still pretends to honor. Half his crew dead or wounded. But the message to German civilians remains consistent. Was dying. We are civilized. At 1,117 hours, Brown lost another engine. As winter deepens in early 1945, Number 3 quit without this narrative becomes even more important. The propeller windmilled briefly, Germany is losing. Anyone with eyes can see engines remained operational on the left side of the aircraft. Refugees flood westward ahead of Soviet made the bomber nearly impossible to control. Supply lines collapse. Brown used every bit of his limited experience propaganda to keep the becomes one of the few tools left to maintain control. He pushed the left rudder pedal nearly to the floor. Believe surrender means torture, they will keep fighting. If civilians believe the enemy will gradual spiral, they will support total war falling behind the protection of the formation. But propaganda only works when it remains struggling bomber separate from the group. When people have no way to compare the story they're told with any other version of reality, 190s positioned themselves and in early 1945 they came from the rear corners, exactly where tail gunner Doc realities could not traverse his guns fast enough to engage. Brown watched them in his mirror, watched the gun flashes, felt the impacts as 20mm shells tore through what remained of his aircraft. The radio operator's position took a direct hit. Sergeant Gerald Fitzgibbon was killed where he sat, his body slumped over the destroyed radio equipment. Brown realized they were not going to make it home. The aircraft was falling apart around 1945. Controls were barely responsive. Public enlightenment and propaganda occupies a building near Wilhelmstrasse. 3 men dead. Its windows blacked out against Allied bombers. The bomber had become a flying coffin, and German fighters were lining up to see their fingers hammering out certainties. He considered giving the order to bail out. The enemy is savage. The surviving enemy members might have a chance if they jumped now. The enemy shows no mercy. Exploded or went into an uncontrolled spin. They have been writing these words for years. But jumping meant certain capture. The rhythm comes naturally. Prisoner of war like breathing. The reports flow from Berlin to every corner of the shrinking Reich. If they survived the parachute descent without being broadcast over crackling radios, ground kept whispered in cellars where families huddled during air raids. The electrical system. The message is always the same. The oxygen system was already gone. Suffer. Men were passing out from lack of air and face what awaits in enemy hands. The co-pilot, Spencer Luke, the propaganda works because it builds on older fears, older stories. Brown reached over and grabbed his collar. The Great War, him upright, the blockade, shook him, the starvation. Luke's eyes opened. They remember how enemies closed again. And now, as Soviet forces push from the east and American bombers darken western passed out or those old memories feel fresh again. Outside temperature was -40°C. They cracked their words section let in a continuous blast just enough detail to make it real without men's faces turned white with frostbite. The German fighters followed the dying bomber down through the clouds, taking turns making firing passes. They described camps where German soldiers vanished into unmarked graves. 17 would either explode or crash into the German countryside enough to check. But it just the constant drumbeat of horror. Brown had no idea and in a nation cut off from the world, aircraft surrounded by out of the sky. These stories find fertile ground. Fuel was leaking from Wehrmacht soldiers carry this knowledge with them into cables were severed. When they fight in the hydraulic lines villages or across the hedgerows yet of somehow the crippled bomber continued forward motion means the end of everything. Losing altitude, not just freedom, but dignity. At 6,000 feet, not just confinement broke through the cloud layer and saw the landscape below. Their officers repeat these warnings before every engagement. Villages. Some add their own embellishments. This was Germany, describing things they claimed enemy to have territory, though the details always come from a friend who knew 400 miles in any direction. In foxholes and makeshift maintain altitude men whisper these stories this much down in the dark. They become a kind of scripture. Question is whether they would crash or make it far enough to bail out over Allied lines. When they look across no man's land at American calculated the distance, they don't see other soldiers. They had crossed into Germany near Bremen. They see the architects of future Allied lines were beyond the Rhine. This belief makes them dangerous. West. Desperate men fight differently than maybe 180 miles an hour. The propaganda gave them roughly 67 minutes of flying time preparing them for the possibility that their sons, husbands, and fathers might never return. Engine number 4 began running rough at 5,000 feet. Not because they died honorably, but because the enemy watched the cylinder head temperature gauge climb. Letters from the front sometimes echo these themes. The engine was overheating. Soldiers reassuring loved battles that they will never allow themselves to be captured. He reduced throttle to prevent seizure. Better to fall in battle with honor than to 160 miles per hour. In prisoner of war camps they had maybe 75 captured Allied soldiers become living proof of German virtue by contrast. They were still losing altitude. See how we treat our enemies with discipline and order. They would be below 1,000 feet in about 30 minutes. Your people would never show such restraint. Too low to bail out safely. The irony goes unnoticed. Too low to glide any conditions in German camps vary wildly depending on which prisoners land in Germany. Soviet began looking for starvation and casual murder. He needed something Western flat, prisoners long, face better clear of obstacles. Governed by conventions Germany still landing in AB-17 was but the message to German civilians remains consistent. But at this low altitude, we are civilized. With minimal control authority, they are not. With 2 engines on one side, as winter deepens in early 1945, this narrative becomes even more important. Told them to secure Germany is losing, brace for impact, anyone with eyes for a rough landing. Cities the men who were conscious acknowledged. Refugees flood westward ahead of Soviet armies. The supply lines would be buried in Germany. Far from in this chaos, propaganda becomes one of the few tools left to maintain Bf 109 appeared off the right wing. If soldiers believe surrender means torture, they will keep fighting. Single-engine if civilians believe the enemy will show no markings, they will support total war. It approached from the starboard side, carefully, but propaganda only works when it remains unchallenged. The German pilot was probably no way to compare the story they're told with any other version of expending ammunition on or and in early 1945, as the Reich crumbles, watched the Messerschmitt pilot two realities separate begin to crack. 2 pilots, same sky, same war, separated by 50 feet of air and the width of an ideology that said one should kill the other. The German pilot looked directly at Brown. Made eye contact. Held it. Then something unexpected happened. Oberleutnant Franz Stigler sits in the cockpit of his Bf 109. The Ministry of Public Enlightenment watching the American bomber struggle to stay airborne, and remembers his windows blacked out against Allied 3 years earlier. Inside, honor is not what makes uniforms lean over typewriters, but it is what makes hammering out certainties. Franz is 27 years old. The enemy tortures 7 combat hours. The enemy shows no mercy. Confirmed kills. They have been writing these words for 2 more aerial victories to earn the Knight's Cross. The rhythm Germany's comes naturally, military decoration. The reports flow from Berlin to every corner would be an easy kill, printed in newspapers, perhaps the easiest of his career, crackling radios, but he cannot bring himself to fire. Huddled during air raids. Franz had landed at the message is always the same. 1,134 if you surrender to refuel and rearm after engaging American bombers to the last breath and face what awaits in enemy hands. His Bf-109 was being serviced. The propaganda works because it builds on older fears, had broken from formation and was limping westward. Germans remember the Great War, the blockade, easy prey, the starvation. Franz took off remember how enemies climbed to 4,000 feet and now, spotted the bomber Soviet against the winter landscape from the east and American bombers darkened western skies. Those old memories feel fresh again. Came up alongside the crippled ministry understands the situation before making his kill. They craft their words carefully. What he saw stopped with just enough detail to make it real without making it too specific to verify. The plexiglass was gone. They speak of prisoners beaten daily, inside the starved deliberately, see the bodies to death and see the blood splattered across the interior walls. They describe camps where German soldiers vanished. The tail section was riddled with holes. The left wing had a massive tear precise enough to cannon fire had ripped through just the constant drumbeat of horror. One engine was feathered, and in a nation cut off another was smoking, surrounded by enemies. This aircraft was already dead. Fertile ground. It just hadn't fallen yet. Soldiers carry this knowledge with them into battle. Himself alongside the bomber. When they fight in the rubble of French villages or across the hedgerows of the American pilot looked young, certainty that capture means the end of everything. His hands not just the control yoke with white knuckles. Not just blood was visible on his flight suit. Their officers directly at Franz with an expression that was neither defiant nor pleading. Some add their own just recognition that his fate was in another man's hands witnessed, though the details always come from a friend who needed for the night's cross. In foxholes and makeshift bunkers, men whisper these stories to each other in the dark. They become a kind of what shooting this bomber would actually shape how soldiers see the world. Not they look across no man's land, not a fair fight between skilled pilots testing their abilities against worthy opponents. They see the architects of future execution. This shooting at makes them dangerous aircraft that could barely fly. Desperate men fight differently than those who see surrender destroying as an option that had no chance to fight back. The propaganda even reaches German instructors' words preparing them for the possibility that their sons, husbands, and fathers might never return. 1940. Not because they died on the Spanish Civil War, because the enemy took them alive. 98 confirmed letters from the front sometimes echo these themes. Had pulled Franz aside one afternoon and told him something never allowed them fighter pilot needed to understand. Better to fall in battle with honor than endure what comes after. And a man first. In prisoner of war camps across the officer first. Captured Allied soldiers before you are anything else. German virtue by contrast. Franz had asked what that meant. See how we treat our enemies with discipline and order, the guards say. If you shoot down an aircraft that is defending never show such restraint. That is combat. The irony goes unnoticed. If you shoot at a parachute, that is murder. Conditions in German camps if you kill a man who cannot fight which prisoners you are not a pilot. Soviet soldiers wearing starvation and casual murder. The words had stayed with prisoners faced better years of war, governed by conventions. Germany still pretends to missions over England and Russia, but the message to German civilians remains consistent. He had always fought with honor. We are civilized, engaged aircraft that can defend themselves. As winter deepens in early attacks when opponents were clearly defeated and becomes even more important. Radio Germany is losing downed Allied pilots. Anyone with eyes can reach them before they died. Cities burn. He had been a fighter pilot. Refugees flood westward not ahead of Soviet armies. Looking at the shattered supply lines collapse. Franz understood that shooting it would cross propaganda becomes one of the few tools left to maintain control. It would change who he was. If soldiers believe surrender the kind of man who murdered wounded enemies for personal glory. If civilians believe the enemy will show no mercy, they will support total war until the bitter end. About how close he was to the only works when it remains unchallenged. Then he thought about what it would mean if he earned it by shooting no way to compare the story they're told with any other version of reality. Franz in early 1949 alongside the bomb crumbles, close the walls the American two realities clearly begin to crack. He made eye contact. Then he did something he had never done before in combat. He saluted. The American pilot stared at him, confused, uncertain what was happening. Franz pointed downward, indicating that the bomber should land. The pilot shook his head. Franz understood. Landing in Germany meant capture, imprisonment, years in a POW camp. The pilot would rather take his chances trying to reach Allied lines. Franz nodded. He understood that choice. Then he moved his Bf-109 into escort formation on the bomber's wing. The Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda crew was going to build him to reach Allied territory. Its windows blacked out against the Allied bombers. German flak batteries along the coast had standing orders to shoot down any Allied aircraft attempting to escape across the North Sea. The enemy is savage. Fighter patrols were active in the area. Prisoners. Ground troops had orders to fire at low-flying enemy aircraft. They have been writing these words for years. The crippled B-17 would be destroyed within 10 minutes if it tried to cross the German coast alone. The reports flow from Berlin to every corner of the fighter escorted it, printed in newspapers, broadcast over crackling radios, whispered in cellars no clear idea how this would work. Raids. He simply knew that he could not shoot this aircraft, if you surrender, let others shoot it either. Better to fight to the last breath until it reached safety or until his fuel ran out. The propaganda works because it builds on older fears, he throttled back to match the bomber's painfully slow airspeed. Germans remember the Great War, the blockade, 160 miles per hour. They remember how Bf-109 could cruise at 350. And now, as Soviet forces pushed flying this slow American bombers darkened western skies, those old memories feel fresh again. But he maintained position, holding the formation off the starboard wing where the bomber crew could see him clearly. They craft their words carefully, feeding the fear with just enough detail to make it real without making it too specific to verify. This made no tactical sense. They speak of prisoners beaten daily, a German fighter escorting an American bomber to death in mines. It violated every principle of where German soldiers vanish into unmarked graves. But Franz didn't care about doctrine. There are never names, never dates precise enough to check. He cared about not becoming a murderer. Just the constant drumbeat of horror. Damaged American cut off from lone German fighter, surrounded by enemies, natural enemies flying in formation as if they were allies. Wehrmacht soldiers carried this knowledge with them into battle. 158 hours, when they fight in the rubble of French villages or across the hedgerows of Normandy, 88mm anti-aircraft guns positioned near the end of everything. The gun crews would see the bomber, but dignity, recognize it as American, not just confined fire, but degradation. The aircraft couldn't take any more damage. Repeat these warnings before every direct hit would finish it. Some add their own embellishments, formation describing things they claim to have witnessed, waggled his wings as he always come from a friend who knew someone who saw it happen. The international signal for in foxholes and makeshift bunkers, men whispered these stories to each other in the dark. Assumed everything in the area must be German, repeated until they shape how soldiers see the world. The bomber passed over the flak position when they look across no man's land at American or British escort formation. They don't see other soldiers. The American pilot was watching. They see the architects of future still confused. This belief makes them beginning to understand that something unprecedented was happening. Differently than those who see surrender as an German coastline at 1,204 hours. Reaches German families. The North Sea stretched the possibility that their sons, and unforgiving, and fathers might never return. The bomber was barely maintaining altitude. Not because they died honorably. If it went down because the enemy took them alive, would die within minutes from hypothermia. Letters from the front sometimes echo no rescue would reach soldiers reassuring loved ones that they will never allow themselves to be captured. He had maybe 10 more minutes before he had to endure what comes after. 10 minutes to escort the bomber far enough from German territory that it might have Allied soldiers become living proof of German virtue. What would happen if anyone in the Luftwaffe found out what he was doing. See how we treat our enemies with discipline dereliction of duty, the guards say. Aiding the enemy. Your people would never show such restraint. He could be irony goes unnoticed. Executed. Conditions in German camps family varied wildly depending on which prisoners occupied him. But he had made his choice. Soviet soldiers faced starvation flew together across the North Sea. Western prisoners faced better treatment, providing visible protection against any German fighters that might intercept. But the message to German civilians remains pointed safely away from the bomber. We are civilized. Made no threatening moves. They are not. As winter deepens in early 1945, his fuel warning light becomes even more important. He had reached the point of no return. Anyone with eyes can see it. He wouldn't have enough fuel to reach any German airfield. Refugees flood westward ahead of Soviet in the North Sea and would die just as surely as the American bomber crew if they went down. In this chaos, propaganda becomes one of the few tools left to maintain control. It was still flying. If soldiers believe surrender means torture, they will keep fighting. Maybe it would make it. If civilians believe the enemy will show no mercy, but he had done they will support total war until the bitter end. He pulled alongside the bomber's cockpit. But propaganda only works when it remains unchallenged. Looking at him. When people have raised his hand in a final story they're told with any other version of reality, then he peeled away, banking hard to the right, heading back toward Germany. As the Reich crumbles, the last thing he saw was the two realities 17 continuing westward, alone now, struggling against the wind and physics and the accumulated damage of too many German guns. Franz flew back to Oldenburg. Landed with his fuel tanks nearly empty. Climbed out of his cockpit and told no one what he had done. Charles Brown crossed the English Channel at 400 feet with both remaining engines barely running and no idea if he could make an airfield near the aircraft disintegrated. Its windows blacked out against Allied bombers. The bomber had descended to wave-top altitude by the time it cleared German coastal uniforms lean over typewriters. Brown could see individual whitecaps on the North Sea below. The enemy is savage. If the engines quit now, the enemy they would have maybe 30 seconds before hitting the enemy shows no mercy. They didn't quit. They have been writing these words for years. 1,237 hours. By now, the rhythm comes naturally, Luke, like regained consciousness. The reports flow from Berlin to every corner of the shrinking saw the destroyed newspapers, saw the bodies over crackling immediately how whispered in cellars where families huddled during air raids. He reached for the control yoke without speaking. The message is always the same. Brown nodded. If you surrender, they would fly this together. Better to fight to the last breath through the haze what awaits in 1,249 hours. The propaganda works because it builds on older fears to see older stories. But they weren't Germans remember the Great War, the nearest airfield was RAF seething, approximately they remember how enemies can be. The bomber had to maintain Soviet forces pushed from the east and American bombers darkened western skies. Number 1 began those old memories feel fresh again. Brown the ministry understands through the airframe, watched the RPM their words carefully, feeding the fear with just enough detail to make it real without making it too specific to verify. Maybe fuel contamination from prisoners beaten daily, starved deliberately, whatever the cause, to death they were losing their last reliable power. They described camps where German soldiers vanished into unmarked graves, trying to squeeze every bit of remaining power from the dying engine. Dates precise enough to check. The vibration increased. Just the constant drumbeat of metal screamed inside the engine, and in a nation cut off from the world, but the propeller surrounded by enemies. These stories at 1,302 hours, Wehrmacht soldiers carried this knowledge with them into battle. The airfield sat in a clearing surrounded by French villages or across the hedgerows of Normandy. They fight control tower that capture means the end emergency of vehicles visible near not the operations building, but dignity. Brown keyed not the radio. Just confinement, but degradation. No their officers power. Repeat these warnings before no every way to contact the tower. Some add their own embellishments without describing things without they claim to have witnessed, hoping that the people on the ground saw the damage and understood knew someone who saw it happen. He entered the traffic holes at makeshift 800 feet. Men whisper these stories to each other in the dark. Too high. They become a kind of but he didn't have time repeated until they shape how soldiers see the world. The engines could quit at any moment. When they look across no man's land, he had to get this aircraft on the ground while he still had many other soldiers. The bomber descended on final approach with landing gear down, but this belief makes them dangerous. Too much damage to the hydraulic system than those who see surrender would have to land fast. Probably 140 miles per hour German instead of the normal 110, preparing them for the possibility that their sons, meant a longer landing roll, and fathers might never return. He hoped the runway was long enough, not because they died honorably, at 200 because feet, the enemy engine number 1 quit completely. Letters from the front sometimes echo these themes. Soldiers Brown reassuring the aircraft that they will never allow themselves to be captured. He compensated with rudder, battle with honor and endure what comes on the runway ahead. In prisoner of war camps across the Reich, he pulled power on the remaining soldiers become living proof of German settled onto the runway hard. See how we treat our enemies with discipline and order, the guards say. The aircraft bounced once, people would never show such restraint, stayed down. The irony goes unnoticed. Brakes. Conditions in German camps vary wildly depending on which prisoners occupy them. He had no brakes. Soviet soldiers faced starvation and dash runway gathering speed. Western prisoners face better treatment toward the dirt governed by conventions Germany still pretends to honor. Spencer Luke reached overhead, but the message to German civilians remains consistent. Compressed air released into the brake lines. They are not. The aircraft slowed. As winter deepens in early 1945, this narrative becomes even more 100 feet from the end of the runway. Germany is losing. Brown shut down the remaining engine. Can see it. Silence. Cities burn. After hours of engine noise and wind and Soviet armies, the sudden quiet was overwhelming. Supply lines collapse. Emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft. Propaganda becomes one of the few tools left to maintain control. They found soldiers believe surrender means torture, unconscious from oxygen deprivation, and one pilot believed the enemy will show no mercy should have been impossible. They will support total war until the bitter end. But propaganda only works when it remains unchallenged. When people have no way to compare the story they're told with any other version of reality. And in early 1945, as the Reich crumbles, the walls that kept these two realities separate begin to crack. Brown was helped out of the cockpit by ground crew members who stared at the damaged bomber Public expressions of disbelief. Propaganda occupies a building near Wilhelmstrasse. Looked like it had flown its windows through a blacked out against Allied bombers. Holes everywhere. Inside, entire sections uniforms lean over typewriters. Structural damage that should have caused catastrophic failure at altitude. The enemy is savage. One crew chief counted the damaged prisoners. 83 enemy shows no mercy. 20mm cannon shells. They have been writing these words for uncounted years. Hits from 13mm machine gun rounds. The rhythm comes naturally, like breathing. Multiple flak fragment impacts. The reports flow from Berlin to every corner of the shrinking destroyed, printed in newspapers. The tail section barely over crackling radios. Both wings structurally families huddled during air raids. Half the control surface is always the same. The aircraft was declared a total loss. Suffer. Better to fight to the last breath than face what awaits in enemy hands. But the propaganda works because it builds on older fears. Spent 6 hours stories. Being debriefed by intelligence Germans officers. Remember the Great War, the blockade, wanted to know everything about the mission. They remember how enemies can be. The damage sequence. As Soviet forces pushed from the east and American bombers darken western skies, he told them about those old memories feel fresh again. How the German ministry understands them to the coast instead of shooting them down. They craft their words carefully. The intelligence officers just enough detail to make it real without making it German fighters didn't escort American bombers. They speak of prisoners they shot them down, starved deliberately, Brown was to death in mines. Confused. They describe camps where German soldiers vanish trauma or oxygen deprivation. There are never
Brown
names,
insisted.
never dates precise enough
The
to
German
check. Pilot had protected them. Just the constant drumbeat saluted them. And
Let
in a
them
nation
go.
cut off from the world,
The intelligence
surrounded by
officers
enemies,
wrote it in their
these
report,
stories
but
find
marked it
fertile
as
ground
Brown.
confirmed. Wehrmacht
They didn't
soldiers
believe it
carry this
happened.
knowledge with them into battle.
Brown believed it.
When they fight in the
Because
rubble
he
of
had
French
been there.
villages or across the
He had
hedgerows
seen
of
the
Normandy,
German pilots
they fight
face.
with the certainty that capture
Had watched
means the
him
end
make
of
a choice
choice that defied every rule
Not
of
just
aerial
freedom,
combat, but dignity. Someone had shown
Not
mercy
just
in a war
confinement,
where mercy
but
was supposed
degradation.
to be impossible. Their officers
Brown
repeat these
didn't know the
warnings
pilot's
before
name.
every engagement. Didn't know his unit.
Some
Some add their own embellishments,
had no way of
describing
finding
things they claim to have witnessed.
The war was still
though the
raging.
details always come from a
Thousands
friend
of
who knew
German
someone who
pilots
saw
were
it flying
happen.
against Allied
In
bombers every
foxholes
day.
and makeshift bunkers,
Identifying
men whispered
one
the
specific
stories
pilot
to each other
a
in the
brief
dark.
encounter was impossible.
They become a kind of
But
scripture,
Brown never
repeated
forgot
until
until they
moment.
shape how soldiers see the
The
world.
salute.
When they
The
look
escort.
across no man's land
The
at
conscious
American or
decision
British
by an
positions,
enemy to
they
preserve
don't
life
see
instead
others
of
taking
soldiers.
it. They
He
see
flew
the
29
architects
more
of combat
future torment.
missions before the war ended.
This belief makes them dangerous.
He survived. Desperate
Returned
men
to the
fight
United
differently than
States.
those who see surrender
Got
as an
married.
option. Had
The
children.
propaganda
even reaches
built
German
a career
families,
outside the
preparing
military.
them for the possibility that their
But he
sons,
always wondered about the
husbands,
German
and
pilot
fathers
who
might
let him
never
live.
return. Not because they died honorably, but because the enemy took them alive. Letters from the front sometimes echo these themes, soldiers reassuring loved ones that they will never allow themselves to be captured. Better to fall in battle with honor than endure what comes after. In prisoner of war camps across the Reich, captured Allied soldiers become living proof of German virtue by contrast. See how we treat our enemies with discipline and order, the guards say. Your people would never show such restraint. The irony goes unnoticed. Conditions in German camps vary wildly depending on which prisoners occupy them. Soviet soldiers face starvation and casual murder. Western prisoners face better treatment, governed by conventions Germany still pretends to honor. But the message to German civilians remains consistent. We are civilized. They are not. As winter deepens in early 1945, this narrative becomes even more important. Germany is losing. Anyone with eyes can see it. Cities burn. Refugees flood westward ahead of Soviet armies. Supply lines collapse. In this chaos, propaganda becomes one of the few tools left to maintain control. If soldiers believe surrender means torture, they will keep fighting. If civilians believe the enemy will show no mercy, they will support total war until the bitter end. But propaganda only works when it remains unchallenged. When people have no way to compare the story they're told with any other version of reality. And in early 1945, as the Reich crumbles, the walls that kept these two realities separate begin to crack.
Berlin,
Franz Stigler
February
survived the war by
1945.
47 days. The Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda occupies a building near Wilhelmstrasse, its windows blacked out against Allied Bf 109 versus American
Inside,
T-51
men in
Mustangs
pressed uniforms
lean over typewriters.
He was
their fingers
outnumbered
hammering
4-1.
out 1, shot down 2 Mustangs,
The enemy is
took
savage.
hits to his own aircraft. The enemy
Crashed
landed
soldiers
in a
prisoners.
field near Munich with his engine
The
on
enemy
fire.
shows
no mercy. He walked away from the
They have
wreckage
been writing
with
these
burns on
words
his
for
hands and
years.
face. By now,
Walked to
the
the
rhythm
nearest
comes
village.
naturally, like breathing.
Found a Wehrmacht officer
The
who
reports
told
flow
Germany
from Berlin
had
to
surrendered
every
the
corner of
previous
the
day.
shrinking Reich, printed
The
in
war was
newspapers,
over.
broadcast over
Franz
crackling
removed
radios,
his Luftwaffe
whispered in
uniform,
cellars where
put on
families
civilian
huddled during air
clothes,
raids, and disappeared into the
The
chaos
message
of
is
post-war
always the
Germany.
same.
He
If
had
you
no
surrender,
desire to
you
be
will suffer.
interrogated by Allied forces
Better to
about
fight
his
to the
combat
last
record
breath
than face what awaits
No
in enemy
interest in
hands.
becoming
a prisoner of war.
The propaganda
when the fighting
works
works because
already
it
ended.
builds on older fears.
He made his
older
way to his
stories.
family's home in Bavaria.
Germans remember the Great
Found
War,
the house
the
damaged
blockade,
but
the
standing.
starvation. His mother
They
was
remember
alive.
how enemies can be.
His sister was alive.
And now,
as Soviet
his
forces
father had
pushed
been
from
killed
the
in an
east and
Allied
American
bombing
bombers
raid in
darkened western
1944.
skies. Those old memories
Franz
feel
told
fresh
his
again.
family
he was finished with
The
flying.
ministry understands this.
Finished with war. They craft their words
He would
carefully.
find work,
feeding
rebuild
the fear
his
with
life,
just enough
try to
detail
forget
to make
the
it
years
real
he had
without
spent
making
killing
it too
people from the
specific to
cockpit of
verify.
a fighter
aircraft. They speak of prisoners
never
beaten
mentioned
daily,
the American
starved
bomber to
deliberately,
anyone,
worked to death in
The
mines.
mission
where he had escorted a
They
damaged
describe
Jeep
camps where
17
German
instead of
soldiers
shooting it
vanished
down
into
was
unmarked
something kept
graves.
private. There are
It
never
didn't fit
names,
the narrative
never
of
dates
what German
precise
fighter
enough
pilots
pilots
were supposed to have done.
Just the constant
It
drumbeat of
raised
horror.
questions he didn't want to
And
answer.
in a nation cut off from the
Besides,
world,
who would
surrounded
believe
by
it?
enemies, these stories
Franz
find
worked in
fertile
construction
ground.
for 2 years.
Wehrmacht soldiers
Hard
carry
labor.
this knowledge with them into
Long
battle.
hours.
When they fight
Low
in the
pay.
rubble of French villages or
But it was
across the
honest
hedgerows
work.
of Normandy, they
No
fight
one was
with
trying
the
to
certainty
kill
that
them.
capture means the end
He
of
went to
everything.
sleep
each night without
not just
calculating fuel
freedom,
loads
but
and
dignity.
ammunition counts. Not just
In
confinement,
1947,
but degradation. He emigrated to Canada. Their officers repeat these
Germany
warnings
was
before
destroyed.
every engagement. The economy was
Some had
collapsing.
their own embellishments,
Food was
describing
scarce.
things they claimed to have witnessed.
Franz saw
though
no
the details
future in
always
staying.
come from a friend who knew
Canada
someone who saw
offered
it happen.
opportunities.
In foxholes
Land.
and makeshift bunkers,
Jobs.
men whisper these stories
A
to each
chance
other
to
in
start
the dark.
over in a country that hadn't
They
been
become a
bombed
kind
into
of
rubble.
scripture, repeated
He
until they
settled in
shape how
British
soldiers
Columbia.
see the world.
Found work
When
as
they
a
look
commercial
across no
pilot
man's
flying
land
cargo
American
planes
or
to
British
remote mining
positions,
camps.
they don't see other soldiers.
Small aircraft.
They see the
Simple
architects of
routes.
future torment. Nothing like the high
This belief
altitude
makes them
combat missions
dangerous.
over Germany. Desperate men
He
fight
married in
differently than those who
1950.
see surrender as an
Had
option.
children.
The propaganda
quiet
even
life
reaches
far from
German
the war.
families, preparing them
He
for the
didn't talk about
possibility
his
that their
Luftwaffe
sons,
service.
husbands, and fathers
Didn't
might
attend
never
veteran
return.
reunions.
Not because they
Didn't tell
died
stories
honorably,
about aerial
but because
combat
the
to
enemy
his
took them
children.
alive. The past
Letters
was the
from the
past.
front
Sometimes echo these
He
themes.
wanted it to stay
Soldiers reassuring loved
Charles
ones that
Brown
they will
never
never allow
allowed
themselves
themselves
to be captured. He returned
Better
to
to
civilian
fall in
life
battle
with honor than
1945,
endure what comes
attended
after.
college,
Became a
in
civil
prisoner
servant
of war
working
camps
for the
across
State
the Reich.
Department. Captured Allied
He
soldiers
married,
become living proof of
had
German
children,
virtue by contrast.
built a career.
See how we treat
But
our
unlike
enemies
Franz,
with discipline
Brown
and order.
couldn't leave the
The guard
guard
completely behind. Your people would
He
never
thought
show
about the
such
mission
restraint.
frequently.
The irony
damage.
goes unnoticed. The fear. Conditions in German
The German
camps vary
pilot who had
wildly
chosen
depending
mercy
on which
over
prisoners
victory.
occupy them. In 1972,
Soviet soldiers
Brown
faced
retired from the
starvation
State
and casual
Department and
murder.
began researching what had happened
Western
that
prisoners
day. Face better treatment. He contacted
governed
the
by
Air Force
conventions
Historical
Germany still
Research
pertains
Agency,
to honor.
requested mission
But the
records
message
from
to
March
German
24,
civilians remains
1944.
consistent.
We
Found
found reports
reports
confirming the basic facts.
They are not.
Ye olde
As winter
pub had been
deepens in
severely
early
damaged.
1945,
This
three
narrative
crew
becomes
members
even
killed.
more important. The aircraft
Germany
barely
is
made
losing.
it back to England. Anyone with eyes
there was
can see
nothing
it.
in
the official records about a
Cities
German
burned.
escort. Refugees
That part
flood
of the
westward
story
ahead of
exists
Soviet
only in
armies.
Brown's
memory and the memories
Supply
of his
lines
surviving crew
collapsed.
members. In this
Brown
chaos,
began writing letters
propaganda
to
becomes
Luftwaffe
one of the
veteran
few tools
organizations.
left to maintain control. He described the incident. If soldiers believe surrender
Asked
means
if anyone
torture,
knew of a
they will
German
keep
pilot
fighting.
who had escorted an American
If
bomber
civilians
instead of
believe the
shooting
enemy
it down,
will show no mercy,
the
responses
responses
were
were
polite
total war
but until the
unhelpful.
bitter end. No one had
But
heard of such an
propaganda
event.
only
works when it remains
Years
unchallenged.
passed.
When
Brown
people have no
continued
way to
searching
compare the
intermittently,
story they're
following
told with
leads
any
that
other
went
version
nowhere,
of reality.
writing letters to people who
And in
couldn't
early
help.
1945,
In
as the Reich
1986,
crumbles,
Brown
the
attended
walls
a
that
reunion
kept
of
these two
former
realities separate
B-17
began to
pilots
crack.
in
In Las Vegas. More than 200 veterans gathered to share stories, reconnect with old crew members, remember the war. During one of the panel discussions, Brown mentioned the German pilot who had spared his aircraft. He described the encounter briefly, matter-of-factly, as just another story from the war. A man in the audience approached him afterward. Asked for more details. Brown provided them. Date. Location. Aircraft type. Altitude. Direction of flight. The man said he was a researcher studying aerial combat in World War II. The Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda try placing an advertisement in a newsletter for former Luftwaffe blacked out against Allied bombers. A long shot, but worth attempting. Men in pressed uniforms lean over typewriters, their fingers hammering out certainties. He wrote a brief notice for a newsletter published by a German fighter pilot association. Prisoners. He described the mission. Shows no mercy. Asked if anyone remembered escorting a damaged for years. 17 on March 24th. The rhythm comes naturally, like breathing. The notice was published in the winter 1990 to every corner of the shrinking Reich. Circulation was small. Newspapers, broadcast maybe over 2,000 copies distributed whispered in cellars for families scattered across Germany, Austria, and the message is always the same. Franz Stigler received his copy in British Columbia in January 1990. Better to fight to the last breath than face what awaits in enemy hands. He rarely read the newsletter. Works because it builds on older fears, his membership in the Fighter Pilot Association. Germans only out of a great sense of connection to the past, the starvation, not because he actively participated. They remember how enemies can be. But something made him open the newsletter that as day. Soviet forces push maybe from the east and American bombers darken western skies, those old memories maybe just random chance. The ministry understands notice on page 17. They craft their words carefully. Franz read it twice. The fear with just enough detail to make it real without making it check specific to verify. March 24th, they speak of prisoners beaten daily, starved deliberately, check the location, worked to death in mines near the German coast. They describe camps where German soldiers vanished into unmarked graves, heavily damaged beaten. There are never names, never dates precise. It was the mission he had never told anyone about. Just the constant drumbeat of horror. The secret he had kept for 46 years. And in a nation cut off from the world, Franz sat at his kitchen table for a long time, find staring at the notice. Wehrmacht soldiers carry this knowledge with them into battle. He never saw it. When they fight in the rubble of French villages or across the hedgerows of Normandy, they fight with the certainty that capture means the end of everything. Opening a conversation with a man he had almost killed. Not just confinement, to actions but degradation. That might still be considered treason. Their officers repeat these warnings before every engagement, revealing something he had kept hidden for nearly half a century, describing things they claimed to have witnessed. But he also thought about the moment though the details always come from a friend who knew someone who saw the choice to preserve life instead of foxholes and makeshift bunkers. The conscious act of mercy stories to each other that had no mercy. They become that moment had mattered, repeated until they shaped how soldiers more than any of his 28 confirmed kills. When they look across no man's land and American or British positions, they don't see other soldiers. Franz wrote a letter to Charles Brown in February 1990. Future torment. He kept it simple. This belief makes them dangerous. Described the mission from his perspective. Desperate men fight differently than those who see why he had chosen to escort instead of shoot. The propaganda even mailed the letter to the address listed in the newsletter for the possibility that their sons, husbands, and fathers might never return. Not because they died honorably, but because the enemy took them alive. Letters from the front sometimes echo these themes, soldiers reassuring loved ones that they will never allow themselves to be captured. Better to fall in battle with honor than endure what comes after. In prisoner of war camps across the Reich, captured Allied soldiers become living proof of German virtue by contrast. See how we treat our enemies with discipline and order, the guards say. Your people would never show such restraint. The irony goes unnoticed. Conditions in German camps vary wildly depending on which prisoners occupy them. Soviet soldiers face starvation and casual murder. Western prisoners face better treatment, governed by conventions Germany still pretends to honor. But the message to German civilians remains consistent. We are civilized. They are not. As winter deepens in early 1945, this narrative becomes even more important. Germany is losing. Anyone with eyes can see it. Cities burn. Refugees flood westward ahead of Soviet armies. Supply lines collapse. In this chaos, propaganda becomes one of the few tools left to maintain control. If soldiers believe surrender means torture, they will keep fighting. If civilians believe the enemy will show no mercy, they will support total war until the bitter end. But propaganda only works when it remains unchallenged. When people have no way to compare the story they're told with any other version of reality. And in early 1945, as the Reich crumbles, the walls that kept these two realities separate begin to crack. The letter arrived at Charles Brown's home in Miami on March 8, the Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda opened it without knowing what it near Wilhelmstrasse. It's just another piece of mail. Allied bombers. Maybe a response to his newsletter inquiry. Men in pressed uniforms lean over another dead end, their fingers hammering out. He began reading. The enemy is sentences in and had to sit down. The enemy tortures prisoners. The letter was from the German pilot. The enemy shows no mercy. Franz Stigler described the mission writing these words that only someone who had been there could know. By now, the rhythm comes naturally, of the bombers like breathing. The missing engine flow from Berlin to every corner of the destroyed nose section, printed in newspapers, the blood broadcast through the crackling radios, whispered in cellars where families huddled during to escort instead of shoot. The message is always the same about his instructor's words regarding honor. You will suffer. Said he had thought about that moment many times over the decades, what awaits never told anyone. Brown read the letter twice because it builds on older fears, then called his wife into the room and read it aloud to her. Germans remember the Great War. She asked if he believed it was authentic. The starvation. Brown said remember yes. How enemies can be. The details were too specific to be as fabricated. Soviet forces push from the east and American bombers darken western skies. He wrote back immediately. Those old memories feel fresh again. Thanked Franz for responding. The ministry understands said this. He had wondered for 46 years who the German pilot was, feeding the fear with just enough detail to make it real without making it too specific. Franz called 2 weeks later. They speak of the conversation was awkward at first, starved deliberately, worked to death elderly men who had been enemies. They described camps where German soldiers vanish into unmarked decades of separation. There are never Franz's names, English never did precise enough to check. Brown had just no the German. Constant drumbeat of horror. They talked for 37 minutes. And in a nation cut off from the world, compared their memories by enemies, these stories filled in gaps in each other's understanding of what had happened soldiers that day. Carry this knowledge with them Franz into battle. Explained that he had been close when to they fight in the rubble of French villages or across the hedgerows of Normandy pub would have been easy. Fight with the certainty that capture choosing not to shoot had cost him recognition, not just freedom to achieve, but dignity. Brown asked why he had made that choice, but degradation. Franz said their officers would have been these warnings before every engagement. The bomber couldn't defend their own embellishments, describing things they claimed to have witnessed, though the details would always come from a friend except satisfying his ambition. In foxholes and makeshift bunkers, men whispered these stories to each other. You saved my life and the lives of my crew. They become a kind of scripture. I've wanted to thank you for they shape how soldiers see the world. Franz replied, when they look across, I was just trying to remain human in a war that made that difficult. They don't see other soldiers. They agreed to meet in person. They see the architects of fly to Vancouver. This
They would
belief
spend
makes
time
them
together,
dangerous.
talk more extensively,
Desperate men
try
fight
to make
differently
sense
than
of
those
what
who
had
see
happened between
surrender
them
as
and
an
what it
option.
meant decades later.
The propaganda
The
even
meeting
reaches
occurred
German
in June
families,
1990
preparing
at
them
Franz
for the
Stigler's
possibility
home in
that their
British
sons,
Columbia,
husbands, and
Brown
fathers
arrived
might
with
never
his
return.
wife.
Not
Franz
because they
greeted
died
them at the
honorably,
door,
but because the enemy
The two
took
men
them alive.
stood facing each other for the
Letters
first
from
time
the front
since
sometimes echo
1944.
these themes, soldiers
Former
reassuring
pilot and
loved
former
ones that
pilot.
they will never allow themselves
Former
to be
American
captured.
and former German.
Better to fall in battle
Former
with honor than
enemies.
endure what comes after.
Franz extended his hand.
In prisoner of war camps across
Brown
the
took
Reich,
it.
captured Allied
They spent
soldiers
3
become
days
living
together,
proof of German virtue by
talking,
contrast. Sharing
see
photographs.
how we treat
our enemies with discipline
comparing
and
flight
order,
logs.
the guards say. Working through
Your
the
people
details
will
of the
never
mission
show
from
such
both
restraint.
perspectives. The irony
Brown
goes
showed
unnoticed.
Franz
Photographs of ye old
Conditions
pub
in
after
German
landing.
camps vary wildly
The
depending
damage
on
was
which
more
prisoners
extensive than
occupied
Franz had realized from his
Soviet
cockpit.
soldiers faced
The
starvation
aircraft
and
should not
casual
have been
murder.
able to fly. Western prisoners
fact that
faced
it
better
did was
treatment,
something close to
governed by
miraculous.
conventions Germany still pretends to honor. But the message to German civilians remains consistent. We are civilized. They are not. As winter deepens in early 1945, this narrative becomes even more important. Germany is losing. Anyone with eyes can see it. Cities burn. Refugees flood westward ahead of Soviet armies. Supply lines collapse. In this chaos, propaganda becomes one of the few tools left to maintain control. If soldiers believe surrender means torture, they will keep fighting. If civilians believe the enemy will show no mercy, they will support total war until the bitter end. But propaganda only works when it remains unchallenged. When people have no way to compare the story they're told with any other version of reality. And in early 1945, as the Reich crumbles, the walls that kept these two realities separate begin to crack. Berlin showed Brown his logbook from 1944. The Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda occupies a building near Wilhelmstrasse, its windows blacked out against Allied bombers. Nothing about escorting. Men in pressed uniforms nothing about the decision he had made. Their fingers hammering out certainties. Brown asked why Franz had kept it secret for so long. The enemy tortures because it didn't fit the story people wanted to hear about. The enemy shows no mercy. German pilots were supposed to shoot down Allied aircraft. By now, the rhythm comes naturally, like breathing. Admitting that he had let an enemy escape might have been seen as cowardice or betrayal. Printed in newspapers, Brown broadcast over crackling radios. He had experienced in similar reactions when he told intelligence officers about the German escort. The message is always the same. No one believed an enemy would do something like that. You will suffer. But it had happened. Better to fight to the last breath. They had faced what awaits in enemy hands. They knew the truth even if no one else believed, because it builds on older fears. On the second day of the visit, Franz and Brown drove to a nearby airfield where a restored B-17 was on display. They remember how enemies can around the aircraft together. And now, as Soviet forces push from the east and American bombers darken western skies, Franz looked at the bomber with an expression Brown couldn't quite read. The ministry understands nostalgia this. Maybe. They craft their words carefully, feeding the fear with just enough detail Brown to make it real without making it too specific to verify. Franz said he was remembering all the B-17s he had shot down before that deliberately, worked to death all the crews he had killed. They described camps where German soldiers vanished into unmarked graves. They had made him an ace. There are never names, never dates precise enough to check. A symbol just of German fighter drumbeat of horror. But now in a nation cut off from the world, he had killed, surrounded by enemies, young Americans like Brown who had families waiting for them. Wehrmacht soldiers who carried this knowledge he had them into battle. Brown when they said fight in the rubble of French villages or across the hedgerows on both sides killed each other. They fight with the certainty that capture means the end of everything. It was duty, not just freedom. Franz shook his head. Not just he said it was personal, but degradation. Every trigger pull their officers personal. Repeat these warnings before every engagement someone else died. Some add their own embellishments. Nations and ideologies they claim to have didn't change the individual the details always come from a friend who knew he said the only decision he was still proud of from the war was the one time he chose not to kill. Men whisper these stories to each other. The day he escorted Brown's bomber instead of shooting it down. They become a kind of scripture, repeated until they shape how soldiers acted according to his own moral code instead of military orders. When they look across no man's land at American or British positions, Brown was quiet for a long time. They don't see other soldiers. Then he said, I'm grateful you made that choice. Future torment. My children and grandchildren are dangerous. Because desperate men fight differently than those who see surrender. On the final day of the visit, Franz the propaganda even reaches German families, a model of a Messerschmitt for the possibility that their sons, husbands had flown, and fathers might never return. Brown gave Franz a model of not because they died honorably, but because they placed the two models side by side on Franz's desk. Letters from the front sometimes echo these American themes, bomber and soldiers German reassuring loved ones that they will never allow themselves to be captured. Franz said the models represented what could have happened if more people on both sides had chosen mercy over prisoner of war camps across the Reich. If more pilots had seen their enemies as human beings instead of virtue. By contrast, Brown agreed. See how we treat our enemies. But he also said that what made Franz's choice significant was precisely that your people would never show such restraint. If everyone had done it, the irony goes unnoticed. The fact that conditions in German camps very wildly depending on which prisoners occupied against the pressures of war. Soviet soldiers face starvation and casual murder. Franz thought about that. Western prisoners face better treatment. Then he said maybe that was by conventions Germany still pretends to honor. Maybe individual acts of mercy mattered more, but the message to German civilians remains consistent. Violence. We are civilized. Brown left British Columbia with a promise to stay in touch. As winter deepens and early 1945, corresponding this narrative becomes even more important. Germany is losing. Anyone with eyes can see it. They became friends. Cities burn. Not despite what had happened westward ahead of Soviet armies, but because of it. Supply lines collapse. In this chaos, propaganda becomes one of the few tools left to maintain control. If soldiers believe surrender means torture, they will keep fighting. If civilians believe the enemy will show no mercy, they will support total war until the bitter end. But propaganda only works when it remains unchallenged. When people have no way to compare the story they're told with any other version of reality. And in early 1945, as the Reich crumbles, the walls that kept these two realities separate begin to crack. In 1992, a writer named Adam Makos contacted Charles Brown about documenting the propaganda occupies a building near was researching unusual encounters between Allied and Axis forces during World War II. Inside, men in pressed uniforms about an American bomber pilot, their fingers hammering out German fighters. He wanted to verify the story and, if true, the enemy tortures prisoners. Brown agreed the enemy shows no mercy. He put Makos in touch with Franz for years. The two elderly pilots comes naturally being interviewed, like breathing, providing documentation. The reports flow from Berlin to every corner of the shrinking Makos verified the stories through military records, broadcast over crackling radios, and whispered in surviving families huddled during air raids. Everything the message is always the same. The mission had happened exactly as Brown and Franz described it. Better to fight to the last breath. The story was published in several military history magazines in the mid-1990s. The propaganda works because it builds on old enthusiasts' read it with fascination. Germans remember the documented case of an enemy pilot choosing mercy in the middle of combat. They remember how enemies contradicted the standard narrative of World War II as Soviet forces pushed from the east and American bombers darkened western skies. Brown and Franz began receiving letters from people who had read about the ministry understands this. Veterans who understood what it meant to make difficult choices in fear with just enough detail to children and grandchildren of World War II pilots who wanted to know more about the human side of prisoners beaten daily. In 1998, Brown and Franz appeared together on a television documentary about German soldiers vanish into unmarked graves. They sat side by side. There are never names, two old men never dates precise describing what had happened 54 years earlier. Just the constant drumbeat of horror. The interviewer asked Franz, and in a nation cut off from the world, surrounded by enemies, these stories find fertile ground. He regretted the men he had killed this knowledge with them into battle. But he would never regret when they fight in the rubble of French villages or across the hedgerows of Normandy. The interviewer asked Brown what he thought about meeting the man who could have ended his life. Brown said Franz had given him something more valuable than his life. Not just confinement, but degradation. Franz had shown him that even in war, their officers repeat these warnings pushed everyone toward brutality. Individuals could still choose to embellish with humanity, describing things they claimed to have witnessed, though the details always come from a friend who knew someone who saw it happen. More veterans reached out to share their own experiences of unexpected to each other in combat. They become a kind of scripture. Adam Makos expanded his research into a full book titled A Higher Call. When they look across no man's land in American or British positions, and the decades-long search that led to Brown and Franz finally the architects of future torment. The book became a bestseller. This belief makes them dangerous. It was translated into multiple languages. Desperate men fight differently than those military academies used it as a teaching tool for discussions about ethics in combat. German families. The story of the possibility fighter became one of the most widely known examples of individual moral choice during World War II. Not because they died honorably, but Brown and the enemy took them alive. The attention was secondary to the letters from the front sometimes echo these themes. They continued visiting each other loved ones that they will never allow themselves to capture together. Better to fall in battle with honor than endure what comes after. They became symbols of reconciliation. In prisoner of war camps across the Reich, two former captured Allied soldiers become not by forgetting what they had been, by contrast, but by acknowledging the choices they had made. See how we treat our enemies with discipline and order, the guards say. Franz Stigler died on March 22, 2008, at age 92. The irony goes unnoticed. Charles Brown died 8 months later, camps on November 24, depending on which prisoners occupy them, at age 87. Soviet soldiers faced starvation for casual years. Western from the moment they reconnected until the end of their lives, by conventions Germany still pretends to honor. But the message to German civilians remains consistent. We are civilized. They are not. As winter deepens in early 1945, this narrative becomes even more important. Germany is losing. Anyone with eyes can see it. Cities burn. Refugees flood westward ahead of Soviet armies. Supply lines collapse. In this chaos, propaganda becomes one of the few tools left to maintain control. If soldiers believe surrender means torture, they will keep fighting. If civilians believe the enemy will show no mercy, they will support total war until the bitter end. But propaganda only works when it remains unchallenged. When people have no way to compare the story they're told with any other version of reality. And in early 1945, as the Reich crumbles, the walls that kept these two realities separate begin to crack. The models still sit on the 1945 B-17 the Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda occupies American a building bomber and German fighter. Its windows blacked out against side in a small museum in British Columbia dedicated to men in pressed uniforms lean over typewriters. Visitors come to see hammering out certainties. They read the plaques explaining what happened on March 24. The enemy tortures prisoners. They ask questions about the no mercy, the decision, the man involved. They have been writing these words for years. The museum curator tells them the story. The rhythm comes naturally. About a damaged bomber struggling to survive. The reports flow from Berlin about a German pilot who chose mercy over victory. Newspapers, broadcast over crackling radios, each other 46 years later and families huddled during air raids. People want to know why the message is always the same. What was going through his mind when he decided not to shoot? Better to fight to the last breath explains what Franz struggled with that question himself for decades. The propaganda works because it builds on answers at different times. Older stories. Sometimes Germans he said remember the instructors teaching about blockade, the starvation. Sometimes he said it was they remember how enemies can recognizing they were already defeated. And now, as Soviet forces sometimes he said it was an American bomber's decision western skies. Fully explain those old memories feel fresh again. But the most consistent answer Franz gave was this. He chose not to shoot because shooting would have changed the fear with just enough detail to make it real without making it too specific. It would have made him someone who killed defenseless people for personal advancement. They speak of prisoners beaten daily, and whatever else the war had made him work to death. He refused to become that. They describe camps where German soldiers vanish into unmarked the Knight's Cross. There are never achieved the recognition precise enough to check. His combat record was impressive, but not exceptional. And in a nation cut off from the world, just another surrounded by enemies, these stories find fertile ground. But he remained himself. Wehrmacht soldiers carried this knowledge with them into battle. Recognition versus integrity. When they fight in the rubble of French villages he chose or across the hedgerows of Normandy, people ask if the story has a moral. That capture means the end of everything. Not just freedom, extracted and applied to other situations. Not just confinement, the curator says the story resists their officers repeat these warnings before every engagement. It's not a tale of good versus evil because both men were fighting for their countries, describing things they claimed to have witnessed, doing what they believed was right always context of their knew someone who saw it happen. It's a story about individuals and makeshift in systemic violence. Men whisper these stories to each other about the narrow space between duty and conscience. They become a kind of scripture, about moments when a person can either follow the rules or follow their understanding. When they look across no man's land at American or British positions, Franz followed his understanding. They don't see other soldiers. Brown benefited from that choice. They see the architects of future torment. They both carried it for the rest of their lives. This belief makes them dangerous. In 2012, men fight German fighter those who see surrender as a memorial plaque at the location where Franz Stigler reached his German on his final combat mission for the possibility that their sons, husbands, the plaque doesn't list as victories or decorations. Not because it mentions only one thing, but because the enemy took them alive. The pilot who chose mercy. Letters from the front sometimes became his legacy themes. Soldiers reassuring loved ones that they will never allow themselves to be captured. Not his combat record. Better to fall in battle with honor than endure as a pilot after. But the one time he saw an enemy who chose not to fire. Captured Allied soldiers became several of Franz's former Luftwaffe colleagues criticized the memorial. See how we treat our enemies. They said it misrepresented what fighter pilots were supposed to do. Your people would never show such combat was weakness. The irony goes German pilots should be remembered for conditions in German camps very wildly depending on which Franz's family defended the plaque. Soviet soldiers faced starvation part of casual war experience that he valued most. Western prisoners face better treatment. The moment when he acted according to his conscience still pretended his honor. But the message to German civilians remains consistent. They established a scholarship in his name for students studying ethics and military history. As winter deepens in early 1945, criteria emphasize moral courage even more difficult circumstances. Germany is losing because that's what the story is. Anyone with eyes can see it. Not aerial combat tactics. Refugees not German and American Soviet armies. Not even World War II specifically. It's about what happens when someone faces a choice between advancing their career and preserving their humanity. If soldiers believe following orders and following they will keep fighting. Between doing what's expected and doing what's show no mercy, they will support total war until the bitter end. Brown lived because of it. But propaganda only works when it remains unchallenged. Both men were able to sit together and acknowledge no way to compare the story they're told with any other version of reality. And in early 1945, as the Reich crumbles, the walls that kept these two realities separate begin to crack. Today, pilots at the Air Force Academy study the encounter as the Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda not as a tactical lesson near Wilhelmstrasse, not as a historical curiosity Allied bombers, but as an examination of moral choice under extreme pressure. Lean over typewriters. Instructors present the uncertainties. German fighter pilot is savage, nearly qualified for his nation's highest decoration. The enemy shows no mercy. 2 more confirmed kills. They have been writing these words for years. A defenseless enemy bomber. By now, the rhythm has every tactical and career-based reason to shoot. The reports flow from Berlin to every corner of the shrinking Reich, printed in newspapers. The responses vary. Broadcast over crackling radios. Some say they would shoot because that's where families huddle during air raids. Fighter pilots are supposed to destroy enemy aircraft. The message is always the same. Showing mercy to enemies prolongs the war and potentially better to fight to the last breath and face what awaits. Others say they would escort because killing the propaganda works because it builds on older fears, older stories. Combat should be between capable fighters. Germans remember the Great War, the blockade, a helpless enemies, execution, not they warfare. Remember how enemies can be. The instructors don't tell them and which now, answer is correct. As Soviet forces push from because the east and American bombers darken western skies, there's only those the choice Franz made and the consequences that follow. The ministry understands this. They explain that Franz sacrificed his career carefully to preserve his moral integrity. Just enough detail to make it real without making it too specific. But he paid a price. They speak of prisoners being earned through years of combat was denied because he chose once to show mercy. They describe camps the real German soldiers vanish into doing the right thing doesn't guarantee reward. There are never names, never dates precise enough the opposite. Just Franz made a moral choice and lost the Knight's Cross. And in a nation cut off from the world, he made the human choice surrounded by anonymous for 46 years. Fertile ground. But he kept his humanity. Soldiers carry this knowledge at the end of his battle. That mattered more to him when they fight in the rubble of French villages or across the cadets wrestle with this reality. They fight with the certainty they're being trained to be warriors. Everything. To fight not just freedom, but to destroy enemy forces. Not just confinement, but they're also being trained to be officers. Their officers repeat these warnings before every engagement. To make decisions that have moral weight. Some add their own considerations, describing things they claim to have witnessed. The story of Franz and Brown forces them to consider where duty ends and conscience begins. Where orders stop being morally neutral and start whispering stories to each other in the dark. Some cadets say the story is an outline, repeated until they shape how soldiers see the world. Has clearer rules of engagement. When they look across no man's land, situations like Franz encounters are unlikely. They don't see other soldiers. The instructors remind them that every combat pilot eventually faces a moment where the rules don't provide clear guidance. Desperate men fight to decide based on their own moral framework as an action to take. The propaganda those moments reaches German families more than any fight for the possibility that their sons, husbands, veteran fathers might sometimes visit the academy to speak about because they died honorably, but because the enemy took them the Franz Stigler story. Letters from the front sometimes echo these themes. Soldiers reassuring would actually make that they will never allow themselves to be captured. The veterans say yes. Better to fall in battle with honor than endure what comes after. Moments when pilots had opportunities to kill but chose across the Reich. Captured Allied fighters retreating from losing German virtue by contrast. Damaged aircraft limping away from treat our enemies with discipline and order. Parachuting pilots who could have been strafed your people would never show such restraint. Those moments don't make it into official combat. The irony goes unnoticed. Conditions in German camps vary wildly depending on which prisoners occupy them. But they happen more often than people soldiers face starvation and casual murder. Because even in war, most people retain prisoners face better treatment. Governed by convention, soldiers still pertains to honor, airmen, and marines. But the message to German civilians remains consistent. Unnecessary killing. We are civilized. The difference isn't always obvious. They are not. As winter deepens in early 1945, this narrative becomes even more important. Franz saw Germany that clearly on March 24, anyone with eyes can see it. On one side was shooting a defenseless bomber to advance westward ahead of Soviet armies. On the other side was letting it go and preserving his sense of who he was. In this chaos, he chose the second option. Becomes one of the few tools left to maintain control. That choice echoes now through military academies. If soldiers believe surrender means torture, conversations about what it means to be a warrior who retains humanity. If civilians believe the enemy will show no mercy, is never whether Franz made the right decision until the bitter end. The question is what you would do if you were in his position. When it remains unchallenged. If your career advancement required have no way to compare the story they're told with any other version of reality. If your orders conflicted with your conscience. And in early 1945, if you had to choose between recognition and integrity, the walls that kept these two realities chose integrity. Crack. Brown lived. They became friends. That's the story. Everything else is interpretation. But here's what remains undeniable. On March 24, 1944, a German fighter pilot saw an enemy bomber and chose not to fire. That choice meant an American crew survived. Went home. Had children. Built lives. Those children had children. Those grandchildren exist because Franz Stigler valued his humanity more than his ambition. That's the echo. Not just the story of two pilots, but the ripple of consequences spreading forward through time. Families that exist because one person chose mercy. Futures that happened because someone refused to kill when killing would have been easy. The models still sit side by side in the museum. B-17 and Bf-109. Allied and Axis. No longer enemies. Just two aircraft that happened to meet in the sky over Germany when the world was at war and one man decided that preserving life mattered more than taking it. That decision meant everything to Charles Brown and his crew. It meant everything to their descendants. And it meant everything to Franz Stigler when, decades later, he could look at his reflection and recognize the man staring back. Not a killer who shot defenseless enemies, but a pilot who flew with honor even when honor required sacrifice. The war ended 80 years ago. The men are gone. But the choice remains. Preserved in military records. Taught in classrooms. Remembered by families who exist because mercy happened when mercy was supposed to be impossible. That's what echoes. Not the violence. Not the destruction. Not the 28 aircraft Franz destroyed or the bombing raids Brown survived. What echoes is the moment when violence could have happened and didn't. When destruction was available and refused. When one man saw another man and chose to let him live. 80 years later, that choice still teaches. Still challenges. Still asks every person who hears the story, what would you have done? Franz answered that question. The echo of his answer continues.